On my own promotion party, my boss promoted my coworker, who started 3 months ago, instead of me. She already does a lot more than you. She deserves it, he said. I smiled and celebrated with them. He had no idea how fun Monday would be. The air smelled like cheap champagne and microwaved hors d'oeuvres. My promotion party. Except it wasn't my promotion. After 2 years of grinding 60-hour weeks at Crestline Marketing, I'd been promised a senior role. But when my boss, Mason, clinked his glass, he announced Isla, the 23-year-old who started 3 months ago, was getting the title. She already does a lot more than you, he said, his Rolex glinting under the fluorescent lights. I forced a smile, my nails digging crescent moons into my palms. The room buzzed with awkward applause. Isla stood there, her designer handbag dangling from her elbow, her smile too wide, too bright. She looked like she belonged in a TikTok ad for Girl Boss energy drinks. I sipped my champagne, the bubbles stinging my throat. 2 years of fixing Mason's spreadsheet errors, covering for his midday golf meetings, and staying late to meet deadlines. And for what? To watch someone half my age waltz in and take what was supposed to be mine? I glanced at Mason. He was laughing now, his arm slung around Isla's shoulders like she was his golden child. His Rolex caught the light again, and I felt a sharp pang of resentment. That watch probably cost more than my monthly rent. Meanwhile, I was barely scraping by, juggling student loans and credit card debt. I thought this promotion would finally be my break. But no. Isla caught my eye and waved me over. Harper, come join us, she chirped, her voice dripping with faux enthusiasm. I plastered on a smile and walked over, my heels clicking against a tiled floor. Congratulations, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. You deserve it. She beamed, oblivious to the tension in my words. Thanks. I couldn't have done it without Mason's guidance. She turned to him, her eyes shining with admiration. Mason chuckled, his chest puffing out like a peacock. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Isla, he said, his tone dripping with paternal pride. I excused myself and headed to the restroom. The moment the door closed behind me, I let out a shaky breath. My reflection stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm the anger, simmering beneath my skin. But as I dried my hands, something caught my eye. A crumpled post-it note on the edge of the sink. I picked it up, smoothing it out. Transfer 15K to Act 7793 by Monday. My heart skipped a beat. Mason's handwriting. What was this? I pocketed the note and stepped back into the party, my mind racing. The promotion sting still burned, but now there was something else. A flicker of curiosity, a hint of suspicion. Whatever game Mason was playing, I was about to find out the rules. That night, I couldn't sleep. The crumpled post-it note sat on my nightstand, taunting me. Transfer 15K to Act, jar 7793 by Monday. What was Mason doing with that kind of money? And why was he hiding it? My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. By 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and opened my laptop. Crestline's financial system was password protected, but I'd been there long enough to know Mason's habits. His password was probably something stupid like Golf 123. I typed it in, and to my surprise, it worked. The files loaded slowly, each one a labyrinth of numbers and transactions. I scrolled through invoices, expense reports, and payroll records, my eyes scanning for anything unusual. And then I saw it, a series of transfers to an offshore account. The amounts varied, but they all had one thing in common. They were labeled as consulting fees. My stomach churned. Consulting fees? For what? Crestline didn't even have international clients. I dug deeper, cross-referencing the dates with Mason's calendar. Every transfer coincided with a golf meeting or a client dinner. Leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. Mason was embezzling, and he'd been doing it for years. But why promote Isla? She'd only been here 3 months. What did she have to do with this? I opened her employee file, my fingers trembling, over the keyboard. Her resume was flawless. Top-tier school, internships at prestigious firms, but something about it felt off. And then I saw it. Under emergency contact, it listed Richard Blake. The name rang a bell. I Googled it, and my blood ran cold. Richard Blake was Mason's estranged brother. Nepotism. That's why she got the promotion. Mason was covering for his brother's kid. I closed my laptop, my mind spinning. I had the proof. I could take this to HR, to the board, to the IRS. But what would that accomplish? Mason would deny everything, and Isla would probably get fired. Stared at the post-it note, the numbers blurring as tears filled my eyes. I'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much. And for what? To be betrayed by the person I trusted most? But then a thought struck me. What if Isla didn't know? What if she was just as much a pawn in Mason's game as I was? I didn't have time to dwell on it. My phone buzzed. A text from Isla. Can we talk? Mason's office. Now. It was 7 a.m. I stared at Isla's text, my heart pounding in my chest. Can we talk? Mason's office? Now? What could she possibly want to talk about? Did she know I'd been digging into the financials? Did Mason suspect something? I threw on a sweater and rushed to the office, my mind racing. The building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as I stepped off the elevator. Mason's office door was slightly ajar, and I could hear Isla's voice inside, soft, trembling. I knocked lightly before pushing the door open. Isla was sitting across from Mason's desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usually flawless makeup was smudged, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than confidence in her expression. Fear. Harper, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something. Mason wasn't there. The office was empty, except for the two of us. I hesitated, then sat down across from her, my arms crossed. What's going on, Isla? She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. I know you hate me, she said, her voice breaking, and I don't blame you, but I'm not who you think I am. I frowned, my suspicion growing. What are you talking about? She slid the USB across the desk toward me. This has everything. Voice recordings, emails, bank statements. Mason's been embezzling from the company for years, and he's been using me to cover it up. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process her words. Why are you telling me this? Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned forward, her voice desperate. Because I'm pregnant, Harper. Mason threatened to fire me if I didn't help him. He said he'd ruin my career, my life. I didn't have a choice. My stomach dropped. Pregnant? Isla? I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her perfect facade, the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. Why didn't you go to HR? I asked. My voice softer now. She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. HR? Mason owns HR. He owns this whole company. I tried to leave, to quit, but he said if I did, he'd make sure I never worked in this industry again. I picked up the USB, turning it over in my hands. The evidence was all here. Everything I needed to take Mason down. But as I looked at Isla, I realized something. She wasn't the villain. She was just another victim in Mason's twisted game. What do you want me to do with this? I asked, my voice steady. She met my gaze, her eyes pleading. Do what? I couldn't. Expose him before he destroys anyone else. I nodded slowly, my mind made up. But as I stood to leave, Isla grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. One more thing, she said, her voice trembling. Richard Blake, he's not just Mason's brother. He's my father. I froze, Isla's words echoing in my mind. Richard Blake, he's not just Mason's brother, he's my father. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Mason's brother was her dad. That meant Mason was her uncle. This wasn't just nepotism, it was a family conspiracy. I sat back down, my legs suddenly weak. Isla, what the hell is going on? Why didn't you tell anyone? She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice shaky but determined. Because Mason made me swear not to. He said if anyone found out, it would ruin the family's reputation. And my dad, he's not exactly stable. Mason's been supporting him financially for years. If this got out, it would destroy him. I stared at her, my mind racing. This was bigger than I thought. Mason wasn't just embezzling. He was using his own family as pawns. And Isla, for all her confidence and ambition, was trapped in his web. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice low. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. Because I can't do this anymore, Harper. I can't keep lying, covering for him. I thought if I played along, I could protect my dad, but I'm losing myself. And now, with the baby, her voice broke, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I need your help. You're the only one who can stop him. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words settling over me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. For me, for Isla, for everyone Mason had manipulated. Okay, I said finally, my voice firm. I'll do it, but you need to be ready for the fallout. Once this gets out, there's no going back. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and relief. I know, and I'm ready. I stood up, the USB clutched tightly in my hand. I'll take this to the board, but first, I need to make sure we have everything. Is there anything else I should know? She hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. This has dates, amounts, and names. Everything Mason's been hiding. It's not much, but it's enough to prove what he's been doing. I took the notebook, flipping through the pages. It was meticulous. Dates, amounts, even notes on who was involved. This wasn't just evidence. It was a roadmap to Mason's downfall. Thank you, I said, tucking the notebook into my bag. I'll handle this. You just focus on taking care of yourself. She gave me a small, grateful smile. Be careful, Harper. Mason's not going to go down without a fight. I nodded, my resolve hardening. Neither am I. As I left the office, the USB and notebook heavy in my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Mason had no idea what was coming, but neither did I. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. I had 2 hours to prepare. I locked myself in a conference room, spreading out the USB, Isla's notebook, and my laptop. The evidence was overwhelming. Offshore accounts, falsified invoices, voice, recordings of Mason admitting to tax fraud. It was all there, neatly organized and ready to blow his world apart. But as I reviewed the files, a nagging doubt crept in. What if the board didn't believe me? What if Mason had them in his pocket too? I couldn't afford to take that risk. I needed a backup plan. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Harper, is that you? Hey, Dad, I said, my voice tight with nerves. I need your help. My dad had been a journalist before he lost his job. Investigative reporting was his specialty, and he still had connections in the industry. If anyone could help me expose Mason, it was him. I explained everything. The embezzlement, Isla's involvement, Mason's threats. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle. This is big, Harper. Really big. If you're right, This could take down not just Mason, but the whole company. I know, I said, my voice trembling, but I can't do this alone. I need someone I can trust. He was quiet for a moment, then sighed. All right, I'll make some calls, but you need to be careful. If Mason catches wind of this, he's not going to play nice. I know, I said, gripping the phone tighter. Thanks, Dad. I hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second bringing me closer to the meeting. I gathered the evidence and headed for the boardroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was already full when I arrived. The board members sat around the long table, their expressions bored and impatient. Mason was at the head of the table, his Rolex glinting as he checked his watch. Ah, Harper, he said, his tone dripping with false warmth. We were just about to start without you. I forced a smile, clutching the USB in my hand. Sorry to keep you waiting. I have something important to share. I plugged the USB into the projector and pulled up the first file. The room fell, silent as the evidence flashed on the screen. Bank statements, voice recordings, Isla's notebook. I explained everything, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Mason's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous, he spat, standing up. These are clearly fabricated. Harper's just bitter because she didn't get the promotion. I didn't flinch. If that's true, then you won't mind if we involve the IRS, will you? The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood up. Mason, sit down, she said, her voice cold. We need to discuss this. Privately. Mason glared at me, his eyes filled with venom, but he sat down, his jaw clenched, so tight I thought it might crack. As I left the room, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. Mason's empire was crumbling, and he knew it, but the fight wasn't over yet. The board meeting dragged on for hours. I waited outside the room, pacing the hallway, my nerves frayed with every passing minute. Finally, the door opened, and the sharp-eyed woman from earlier stepped out. Her expression was unreadable. Harper, she said, her voice calm but firm. The board has decided to place Mason on immediate leave pending an investigation. We'll be working with external auditors to verify your claims. I nodded, relief washing over me. Thank you. I know this isn't easy, but it's the right thing to do. She studied me for a moment, her gaze piercing. You took a big risk coming forward. Not many people would have had the courage to do what you did. I shrugged, trying to downplay the weight of her words. I just did what I thought was right. She gave me a small, approving nod. We'll be in touch. As she walked away, I leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. It was done. Mason was suspended, and the investigation was underway, but the victory felt hollow. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Isla. How did it go? I typed back quickly. Mason's on leave. Investigation started. Her reply came almost instantly. Thank you, Harper. I mean it. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Isla had been complicit in Mason's schemes, but she was also a victim. I couldn't decide if I pitied her or resented her. I headed back to my desk, my mind racing. The office was eerily quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by hushed whispers and sideways glances. Everyone knew something had happened, but no one dared to ask. I packed up my things, my hands trembling slightly. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here. As I walked out of the building, the weight of everything hit me like a tidal wave. I'd exposed Mason, but at what cost? My career at Crestline was over. My reputation was tainted. And Isla, I didn't even know where to begin with her. I pulled out my phone and dialed my dad's number. He picked up on the first ring. How'd it go? He asked, his voice tense with anticipation. Mason's on leave, I said, my voice flat. The board's investigating. He let out a low whistle. That's huge, Harper. You did it. Yeah, I said, staring at the ground. But now what? I can't go back there. I don't even know if I want to stay in this industry. He was quiet for a moment, then sighed. You'll figure it out. You always do. But for now, just take a breath. You've been through hell. Give yourself some time to process. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks, Dad. I hung up and slid my phone into my pocket, staring up at the building I'd called my second home for 2 years. It looked different now. Cold, impersonal, like a stranger. I turned and walked away, my steps slow but deliberate. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I was done playing by someone else's rules. The next few days were a blur. I stayed home, avoiding calls and emails, trying to process everything that had happened. The news broke quickly. Mason's suspension made headlines, and rumors about Crestline's financial misconduct spread like wildfire. Reporters called nonstop, but I ignored them. I wasn't ready to talk. Isla texted me again, asking if we could meet. I hesitated, but finally agreed. We needed to clear the air, even if I wasn't sure where we stood. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from the office. Isla looked different. No designer handbag, no perfect makeup. She looked human. Thanks for coming, she said, her voice soft. I nodded, sliding into the booth across from her. What did you want to talk about? She took a deep breath, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. I wanted to explain about my dad, about everything. I stayed silent, letting her talk. My dad, Richard, he's not a bad person, she began, her voice trembling, but he's struggled his whole life. Gambling, debt. Mason's been bailing him out for years. When I got the job at Crestline, I thought it was my chance to help him, but Mason, he used that. He said if I didn't do what he asked, he'd cut my dad off, and I couldn't let that happen. I studied her, trying to reconcile the confident, ambitious Isla I'd known alone with the vulnerable woman sitting in front of me. Why didn't you tell anyone? She laughed bitterly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Who would I tell? Mason's the CEO. He owns the company. I thought if I just played along, I could protect my dad and keep my career, but I was wrong. I leaned back, my mind racing. Isla wasn't the villain I'd painted her to be. She was just another casualty in Mason's game. What are you going to do now? I asked. She shrugged, her eyes downcast. I don't know. I resigned this morning. I can't go back there. Not after everything. I nodded, understanding all too well. What about your dad? She sighed, her shoulder slumping. I don't know. I'm trying to get him into rehab, but it's complicated. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging between us. Finally, I spoke. Isla, I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry too. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was scared. I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. We both were. She gave me a small, grateful smile. What about you? What are you going to do? I leaned back, staring out the window. I don't know, but I think I'm done with corporate life. Maybe it's time to try something new. She nodded, her smile widening slightly. Whatever you do, you'll be amazing at it. Smiled back, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, we could both move on from this. A week later, I received an email from the board. The investigation was complete and they wanted to meet with me. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The meeting was held in the same boardroom where I'd exposed Mason. The atmosphere was tense, the board members' faces unreadable as I took my seat. Harper, the sharp-eyed woman, now the interim CEO, began, her tone formal. We've reviewed the evidence you provided, and we've concluded that Mason's actions were indeed fraudulent. He's been terminated and will be cooperating fully with the authorities. I nodded, relief washing over me. Thank you. I'm glad the truth came out. She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. We also want to thank you for your courage in coming forward. It's not easy to stand up to someone in a position of power, especially when the stakes are so high. I shrugged, trying to downplay the weight of her words. I just did what I thought was right. She smiled, a rare warmth in her eyes. We'd like to offer you the senior role you were originally promised. You've more than earned it. I hesitated, my mind racing. The promotion I'd wanted so badly was finally within reach. But as I looked around the room, I realized something. I didn't want it anymore. Thank you, I said carefully, but I'm going to have to decline. The room fell silent, the board members exchanging surprised glances. May I ask why? The interim CEO asked, her brow furrowed. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. This company, it's not the same to me anymore. What happened with Mason, with Isla, it changed everything. I need to move on. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. I understand. If you change your mind, the offer stands. I thanked her and left the room, my steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. But as I stepped outside, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Watch your back. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Mason. It had to be him. I quickly blocked the number, but the damage was done. The fear I thought I'd left behind came rushing back, a cold knot tightening in my chest. Mason was gone, but his shadow still loomed over me. The text rattled me more than I wanted to admit. I spent the next few days looking over my shoulder, jumping at every noise, every unfamiliar face. I knew Mason was gone, but his threat lingered like a dark cloud. I decided to call my dad. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm but concerned. Harper, everything okay? Not really, I admitted, pacing my living room. I got a text. It was threatening. I think it was Mason. He was silent for a moment, then sighed. I was afraid of this. Mason's not the type to go down quietly. You need to be careful. I know, I said, my voice trembling. But what do? I can't just sit here waiting for him to make a move. You're not going to, he said firmly. I've got a friend in the police department. I'll give him a call, see if they can keep an eye on you. And in the meantime, stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thanks, Dad. Anytime, kiddo. You've got this. I hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My dad was right. I couldn't let Mason intimidate me. I'd come too far to let him win now. The next morning, I met with a lawyer to discuss my options. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a reputation for taking down powerful men. Harper, she said, shaking my hand firmly. I've heard a lot about you. You've got guts. Thanks, I said, sitting down across from her. But I need your help. Mason's still out there and I don't feel safe. She nodded, her expression serious. I understand. We can file for a restraining order, but that's just a piece of paper. What you really need is leverage. Leverage? I asked, frowning. Yes, she said, leaning forward. Something that ensures Mason stays away from you for good. Do you have any more evidence against him? Anything that could put him away for good? I thought for a moment, then remembered the USB Isla had given me. I have recordings of him admitting to tax fraud and offshore account details. Her boss eyes lit up. That's perfect. If we can get that to the right people, Mason won't just be out of a job. He'll be behind bars. I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Let's do it. As I left her office, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Mason had tried to intimidate me, but he'd underestimated me. I wasn't just a pawn in his game anymore. I was the player. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. With my lawyer's help, I handed over the evidence to the authorities. The case against Mason grew stronger by the day, and the media frenzy intensified. Headlines screamed about corporate corruption, and Mason's name became synonymous with greed and deceit. I tried to stay out of the spotlight, but it was impossible. Reporters camped outside my apartment, and my inbox was flooded with interview requests. I declined them all, focusing instead on rebuilding my life. Isla reached out again, this time with an offer I hadn't expected. "I'm starting over," she said over coffee, her voice steady but hopeful. "I've been thinking about opening a small marketing agency. Nothing fancy, just honest work, and I'd love for you to be part of it." I stared at her, surprised. "You want to work with me?" She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're the most talented person I know, Harper. And after everything we've been through, I think we'd make a great team." I hesitated, my mind racing. Working with Isla wasn't something I'd ever considered, but the idea wasn't entirely unappealing. We'd both been through hell, and maybe, just maybe, we could help each other heal. "I'll think about it," I said finally. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "That's all I ask." As I walked home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about her offer. Starting fresh with someone who understood what I'd been through, it was tempting, but I wasn't ready to commit just yet. The next morning, I received a call from the police. Mason had been arrested. I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The officer on the phone warned me that Mason's arrest might make him even more dangerous. "He's desperate," the officer said. "Desperate people do desperate things. Stay vigilant." I thanked him and hung up, my heart pounding. Mason was behind bars, but his shadow still loomed over me. That night, I dreamed of him, his cold, calculating eyes, his smug smile. I woke up in a cold sweat, my sheets tangled around me. I knew then that I couldn't let him control my life anymore. I had to move forward, no matter how hard it was. The next day, I called Isla. "I'm in," I said, my voice steady. She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I knew you would be." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind me. Starting a new business with Isla was both exhilarating and terrifying. We rented a small office space downtown, filled it with secondhand furniture, and got to work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. The first few weeks were a blur of late nights and endless coffee. We pitched to small businesses, built websites, and crafted marketing strategies. It was hard work, but it felt good to create something honest, something that wasn't tainted by greed or lies. Isla and I grew closer as we worked together. We didn't talk much about Mason or the past, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. We'd both been through hell, and now we were fighting to build something better. One evening, as we were wrapping up a client proposal, Isla turned to me, her expression serious. "Harper," she said, her voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you." I looked up from my laptop, my heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been in touch with my dad. He's getting help. Rehab, therapy, the whole thing, and he wants to apologize to you." I stared at her, surprised. "To me? Why?" She shrugged, her eyes downcast. "He knows what Mason put you through, and he feels guilty for his part in it. He wants to make things right." I leaned back in my chair, processing her words. Richard Blake had been a shadowy figure in this whole mess, but I'd never really thought about him as a person. "I don't know, Isla," I said finally. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." She nodded, her expression understanding. "I get it. Just think about it, okay?" I promised I would, but the truth was, I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready to face Richard. Some wounds were too deep to heal. As the weeks turned into months, our little agency started to gain traction. We landed a few big clients, and the buzz around our work grew. It was exhausting, but it was also the most fulfilling thing I'd ever done. One night, as I was locking up the office, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you've moved on, but you haven't. You'll never be free of me." My blood ran cold. Mason. I quickly blocked the number, but the damage was done. The fear I thought I'd left behind came rushing back, a cold knot tightening in my chest. Mason was behind bars, but his shadow still loomed over me. I didn't tell Isla about the text. I didn't want to drag her back into the darkness we'd worked so hard to escape. Instead, I focused on the agency, pouring myself into every project, every client meeting. But no matter how busy I was, Mason's words lingered in the back of my mind, a constant, unwelcome reminder. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a client's campaign, Isla burst into my office, her face pale. "Harper," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." She handed me her phone and my stomach dropped. It was a news article. Mason had been released on bail. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. "How is this possible?" Isla shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but we need to be careful. He's not going to let this go." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "We'll be fine. He's not going to win this time." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. Mason was ruthless, and he had nothing left to lose. That night, I went home and double-checked the locks on my doors and windows. I slept with my phone by my side, just in case, but the call never came. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find Isla already there, her face drawn but determined. "We're not going to let him scare us," she said, her voice firm. "We've worked too hard to let him ruin this." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Isla was right. We'd been through hell, but we'd come out stronger. Mason could try to intimidate us, but he couldn't take away what we'd built. As the days turned into weeks, we kept our heads down, focusing on the agency. Mason's trial loomed on the horizon, but we tried not to think about it. We had a business to run, clients to impress, and a future to build. One evening, as we were closing up the office, Isla turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Harper," she said, her voice soft, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't stood up to him?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "No, because we did, and that's all that matters." She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You're right, we did." As I locked the office door and walked away, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Mason's shadow still loomed, but it didn't control me anymore. I was free.